You asked and Imperial listened. Due to extreme popularity and brewer demand, the A44 Kveik blend is being released as a year-round available strain. This blend of 3 proprietary Kveik strains absolutely loves hot fermentations, producing beers bursting with fruity notes of pineapple, guava, and tropical flavors. Use it for your summer blonde ales, your hazy IPA, or anything else you want to have a delectable fruity fermentation character. And A44 is absolutely perfect for those who may not have the ability to precisely control fermentation temperatures. Just pitch your pouch and let her rip. Pick up your homebrew pouch wherever Imperial Yeast is sold and place commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. It feels like just yesterday we were answering questions from listeners for the 12th Brü A episode, but in fact it was 3 months ago. Oh, how time flies. This is the 140th episode of the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me yet again to answer even more of your questions is contributor Matt Del Fiacco.
I can't believe it's been 3 months.
God, I know.
We've been doing this with just you and I, and so I'm super excited, and there's a lot of great questions. I mean, what have you been up to for like 3 months, man?
For the most part, sitting in my house and going to, I have an essential job. My real job is
right.
essential. And so I've been going to work, but they even cut us down for a little while to just working a couple of days a week and then doing some telework. But this quarantine business has really been cramping our Brülosophy style, man. It's crazy to think.
I know.
We have not been able to collect data for nearly 2 months now? I mean,
yeah. Yeah, it's been quite some time, and it's also like I didn't realize, and this is going to sound weird because like obviously I've done the math before, but I didn't realize how much beer we make because like now I just have all of it without like sharing it with a bunch of people and going to clubs and doing that, and so it's getting to the point where I'm like I need to brew again, but I also don't have free kegs, so I got to start making some like tactical decisions here on do I buy a keg, do I dump something that's not bad, or we'll see.
Smaller batch sizes, right?
Yeah, maybe that might be an answer.
Yeah. I'm in the same boat, man. I've actually, what's weird is you would think that during the quarantine, we'd have all this free time to brew. And I know a lot of people have been brewing more.
Sure.
But I really haven't. I'll tell you what, as crappy as this situation is, one good thing to come out of it is that it seems like the interest in homebrewing overall it appears to be quite high. It's growing. I've talked to a number of folks in the industry, online shop owners, gear manufacturers, people like that, who are seeing the same bump that we are in traffic. We've seen a lot. I mean, we've got a lot of new listeners. We've got a lot of new people coming to the website, reaching out, saying that they just discovered us, which, we've been around for 6 years. I think that's pretty cool. In fact, I've heard from a number of people who either they just decided to give brewing a shot for the first time, or they're jumping back into it after a hiatus, which is awesome. I absolutely love that. I mean, why wouldn't we love that? And what better thing to do when you're stuck at home than make your own beer,
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's something to do, and especially if you're like, I'm in the same boat as you, where I'm still working, but I'm working from home full time. And honestly, it feels like I wake up, start working, and then like burn myself out for like 8 or 9 hours, and then am like vegging out for the remaining hours of the day. And so like I don't find myself with tons of time. And so, but if you have time, like I would love to spend a couple days just like hanging outside and brewing. I might actually take time off soon just to do that, like take a mental health day and spend some time brewing and cleaning up the garage. But this is such a good time to get into brewing. I mean, because one, like more people influx means you can support local shops, and you can support, I know some shops that are doing curbside pickup for ingredients and such. And then obviously like supporting online shops. So that's awesome, like, because it's a difficult time for everyone financially. And if it's, I mean, obviously probably not for everyone, but it's uncertain for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
And so like doing that support and then supporting local breweries with curbside pickup has been something we've been trying to do. So it's a cool time to start brewing and like just getting into that, because it's also a time when so many people need support and so many people need that. So it's kind of awesome.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And speaking of support, I've also noticed a pretty steady flow of new patrons, which is really inspiring because it says to us that you appreciate what we're doing here at Brülosophy and you don't want us to stop. If you're unfamiliar with Patreon, it's a platform where they make a monthly pledge and receive rewards for their support. Our most popular being a unique monthly discount at YakimaValleyHops.com, which just this month, coming out, we just released this month's reward. So you have a whole entire month to get in on this one. It's $7 off each pound of South African hops you buy. So you $5 tier, $5 a month, you can save upwards of, as much as you want, $7 off each pound of South African hops. So it's a pretty good deal, I would say. At the $3 tier, patrons are invited to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Just this weekend, Noah Bissell of Bissell Brothers was the guest. And coming up in June, I'm really stoked for this one, is Anderson Valley Brewing Company's brewmaster, Fal Allen, who has an extensive brewing history and is just a wealth of knowledge. They make one of my favorite amber ales, which, that's a style that doesn't get much love these days. If you've ever heard Fal speak, this session's going to be killer. He'll be taking questions on June 13th. So you got to be sure to make your pledge before then to be a part of this event. And then you can go back and watch all past sessions on our private Facebook page as well. You can learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/brewlosophy. All right. Feedback this week is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who have an array of amazing purpose-built stainless brewing products to improve your brew day. If you're looking for a high-quality pilot brewery, make sure to check out the BH15 single-tier system. This thing is just absolutely beautiful. Comes with a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Head over to brewershardware.com to see what they're all about, and make sure to mention Brewlosophy when you're checking out to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Listener and Englishman Tony Fiore wrote in with feedback on our short and shoddy English Porter episode. I'll not embarrass myself with yet another lousy attempt at an accent. So here's what Tony had to say. Jolly good day to you. Being an English brewer, God save her Madge, and frequent listener of your wireless radio program, I was gobsmacked to hear that you were adding English Porter to your list of bodged brews. I was flabbergasted that you would have the audacity to throw a spanner in the works to such an extent as you did on the short and bloody well shoddy episode. Me old mum's ticker would explode if she heard some of the corners you cut in that episode. 2 odd hours to brew a porter? Not on all the tenors in the Royal Mint, I said. Well, after listening to the whole episode with great trepidation, you may be pleased to know that you've only gone and bloody well changed this old codger's mind. The shopping is in my trolley, and I plan on brewing up Brewlosophy-style porter to give to my pals down the pub. Nice one, and cheers, my dears.
I want to be this guy's friend so badly. I really desperately want to be friends with this person. Also, because I really do want to know how much that is tuned up for our amusement, the slang and all that versus not. I appreciate it either way, but yeah, I mean, definitely, I've had mixed, experience with the short and shoddy methods, and I don't know necessarily where all of it stems from, and style dependencies. I have done a short and shoddy porter also, and I really enjoyed it. So yeah. I hope that works out for you, man. Definitely. My favorite thing I've heard is one of the guys from Epiphany Malts was just saying modern malts are jet fuel to a lot of degrees, where it's just it's all about sugar, it's all about conversion. So you do that short mash, and I know Kai Troster has this on Brew Kaiser a little bit. He has a great chart of some of the just conversion numbers, and it happens quick. It's definitely still impacted, and there's a lot that goes on in the mash that's not just sugar extraction too. So there's another part to it, but I've done it, and I've had good experiences with it. I've enjoyed the beer, and I hope you enjoy yours.
Yeah, you know what? If I feel like Malcolm could go back and forth with Tony talking like that, because Malcolm has sent us emails that sound exactly like that, because he's got English roots. I think in fact his parents were born in Britain. But anyways, thanks for the feedback, buddy, and please do let us know how your your bodged porter turns out. All right, if you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com, or you can leave us a note on social media. So I really appreciate a good surprise, especially when it involves beer. Well, listener Brett Hansen sent me a bottle of what he calls his winter holiday ale. And while he shared most of the details about it, he left out the type of yeast used. He actually hid it on the notes that he sent me because he didn't want to taint the opinions of me or the friends that I was sharing the beer with.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Heads up with the barley wine. I can already tell. Don't even have to sniff it.
It does smell.
Barley wines are very stinky.
I'm not smelling much.
Your face tells a terrible tale.
It's odd.
We're odd. You're odd. It's not a barley wine. Oh, dude, this is good.
Really?
This tastes delicious. This is an amber.
A little metallic-y tasting.
Metallic-y?
Yeah. It's just,
This is an amber ale, I think. You know what? I'm tired of guessing. This is an amber ale, and I'm going to judge it based on my knowledge. I judge it to be it's a delicious amber ale is what it is.
All right.
No, it might not be. No, it is.
I don't like it.
This tastes like Firestone Walker DBA. I like it a lot. I would put it on top of my house.
I would not.
That's why we're together, because we're different. Clinky.
Cheers.
I like it a lot, dude. I give it 6.9 jerseys.
We're just going to go with a 4. for a total of 15.
First off, I think Jers may have had been a too few many in because this one did not taste anything at all like DBA. If you've ever had Firestone Walker DBA, it's a very clean amber ale with maybe a hint of barrel character, but otherwise just a nice clean amber ale. To me, this winter holiday ale had kind of a spicy caramelly aroma with a really earthy but surprisingly clean flavor. It wasn't peculiar, but it was unique, if that makes sense. It was also very, very highly carbonated, so I kind of had I was wondering if maybe something had gone wrong in the bottle, but it didn't taste bad. It was good. Nothing I didn't like about it. I probably wouldn't want a keg of it on tap, just not my style. But I was curious what yeast he used, and so when I unfolded the paper that Brett included in his notes, he fermented this thing at 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius with a Kveik strain. So pretty interesting.
Oh, did he say what Kveik strain it was?
He said it was Hothead.
Oh, okay. All right, great. Yeah. So I think Hothead is Hornindal, and we're going to get emails about both that being wrong and my pronunciation. But I think that is true. But I think that's Omega's yeast, which is really, really phenomenal. I think it was one of the first Kveiks on the American market that really took off. But I know people who have had amazing experiences with that yeast, and it sounds like his was as well, very clean. Didn't experience too many off flavors or off characteristics or esters from the warm fermentation, which sounds great. I will say, what stands out to me is Tim's comments about having a nondescript, unique aroma. There was something in there, I think, that he couldn't quite place. And then obviously he picked up the metallic, which I haven't heard metallic is associated really as an off flavor with Kveik typically. Sure. That may be the case, but I haven't really heard that so much. But it sounds like he got what he wanted in terms of a pretty clean beer. That I'd be interested in how fast he turned it around. That's, I know, kind of the other thing too, right? It's okay, if it's at 90 degrees and it takes 3 days and it gets carbonated, how does it turn out? It might have been it's always possible he did turn it around really quick and then it wasn't quite done, and maybe it did carbonate a little more in the bottle when it got sent to you and was warm. That's sort of what I was thinking, because it didn't have any contamination off flavors or anything like that. It was surprisingly clean, and that was the note that I underlined in my tasting notes. Brett said, I remember you saying Kveik beers have a certain Kveik character. Of course, I picked that up, but I completely own that it was probably because I was influenced by knowing after reading this that there was Kveik there. I didn't write that down in my notes, so we did this tasting 3 months ago. So I don't know if I picked it up beforehand, but there was a Kveikiness to it, but it wasn't unpleasant. It was pretty good. So thank you for sending the beer in, Brett. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim, you can email me, marshall@brulosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. When we return from this break, answers to your questions.
The Brü in a Bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the Brü Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brü Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard Brü in a Bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brü Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com.
Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. The questions have continued to flow in, and we've only so much time. So if we don't get to yours in this episode, if you've submitted one and we don't answer it, expect it in a future Brü A. All right, let's get this ball rolling. First question comes from Dustin Beniston from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. He says, I've really enjoyed your talks on bias, which I often think about when enjoying my own or another's beer. Recently, I was speaking to a good friend, and I brought up how much better sandwiches are at restaurants. And if I make that exact sandwich at home, it just seems subpar, which got me thinking about the bias and expectations at play in my own brewing. My question then is, how do you think bias and expectations play into tasting your own beer? I often find my beer is so-so when my friends might rave about it. Do you think we sometimes unconsciously create an unattainable level of expectation that fosters a bias that ultimately affects the appreciation of our own beer? Is store-bought beer, like that restaurant sandwich, actually that much better than my homemade version? Or are my bias and expectations just taking a back seat and allowing me to fully enjoy the restaurant sandwich? What a fantastic question.
This is a really great question. And I think actually there's kind of like two questions in here and like three sort of sub themes that are going on. It's a really big question, and it's one obviously near and dear to my heart. So I want to do a couple of these things like a cursory form of justice. So first off, the difference between the sandwich at the restaurant and the sandwich at home is that there is a large amount of salt in the restaurant at the sandwich at the restaurant.
So
that's the
practical
difference.
You are, Matt.
So that's exactly what it is. So here's the thing. That was really hyperbolic, but it's really that's a part of it, is that there is like a chemical difference between those two sandwiches.
Yeah.
That is salt, that is different ingredients, it's different preparation, all that good stuff. So when we talk about bias, I also don't want us to lose sight of the fact that there is a chemical reality of the world, which our brain interprets, but then bias plays a role in the interpretation of said reality, like through your brain, right?
Okay.
So think of let's say objective reality, which is just like atoms are organized in a specific way, is outside the window and you're inside, and then the window itself is your bias. Like the way in which you see the world is all influenced and interpreted by the bias.
Absolutely.
So 100%, of course, like bias plays a role, because bias plays a role in absolutely everything of every aspect of our lives, because that is just the reality of being human. So but I also don't want us to lose sight of the fact that very likely those things are also chemically different. And there are tendencies as humans, like we're all different. We all have different structures, different preferences, but there are trends in how certain things are perceived, like collectively, just based, because again, human. So I think what you nailed though in your comment is that the role bias plays in this, and you're out at a restaurant. You've heard good things about the restaurant. You're more likely to taste good things. The atmosphere seems really great. Maybe the waiter was funny. The food is presented like in an aesthetically pleasing way. And also you're paying for it. So on some level, like it better be good because it's costing you money. And so like there's all these things that like do factor into it, of course. But getting to your beer personally, you have a bias, of course, about your beer and what you expect from it and what you expect from the flavor based on what you put into it and your understanding of the style. And then you have that same expectation for store-bought beer or a specific brewery. And then you purchase that beer, again, sink money, your friends, and then with our own beer, we sink time. And we also have like kind of this idea of like, oh, I'm doing this the way I believe it's best done, so therefore it's going to be better because I'm doing it the right way versus the wrong way. Like it's all that kind of stuff. And also, I will say, like, your friends and family also have their own bias about both the beer and then also about you.
Right.
So, like, politeness theory is a really rich and amazing field. If you ever have, like, a really nerdy, boring rabbit hole, politeness theory is fascinating to me. But there's so much here, and it's just, I want to do the question justice, but basically the answer to your question is, like, yes, bias plays a role. Also, some of the beers at the store might be better. Some of them might be worse.
Yeah.
That's all. It's absolutely the case. And also it's opinion. It's your own personal preference.
Well, so there is this phenomenon wherein when somebody else does something for us, it tastes better, it feels better, whatever. And I don't know why. I know it's been studied. I've read studies on this stuff. You could literally have you could take one person, have them make their own sandwich with all the same ingredients, and then have somebody else make that sandwich for them, and 9 times out of 10 they're going to prefer the same exact sandwich made by somebody else. And I tend to think there's an element of, I'm using the sandwich, because that's what Dustin brought up.
No, of course, yeah.
But it's funny because I also I like Dustin's question, and my hunch is he's a pretty humble dude. And I have this. I've been brewing for a long time, and I've been doing psychology for even a little bit longer than that. So I've observed this interesting trend with brewers, and it's that those who are a little bit more critical, not mean to themselves. They're still brewing. It's not like they think they suck, but who are a little bit more critical and may think that they've got flaws in their beer, tend to be the ones who are a little bit more humble and probably more polite to others and more willing to give good feedback rather than just tear the beer apart. But we've all met that brewer who swears they're the best as well. And they never screw up. Every beer they make is great. And those are the ones who just want to tear down everything else everyone's doing. Or they'll talk bad about some commercial beer that everybody else really likes. So I think there's a lot at play there. And I think personality is also a component of how we perceive our beer. I've had friends who are great friends who get hung up on one thing, and one of our brewing friends group, they'll get hung up on one thing, house flavor, or there's this character in your beer, and that's all they focus on every time. And I think like that's bias as well. We do that with our own beers. We do that with our own brewing. We have opinions about ourselves that we don't consciously think of all the time, but that plays into how we're going to perceive what we did with our beer as well. I love the question. And by the way, I will always take a sandwich made by somebody else over the one made by me. I don't care if it's the same ingredients. And I agree with Dustin, man. And you're right. Ingredients are different. If you go to the sandwich store, ingredients aren't terribly different if you go and grab, a 6-pack of DBA off the shelf and then you try to make one at home. But processes, we all know that there's, brewer's thumbprint. We've talked about that before. So yes, bias plays a role, but also, I think a lot of people, I already said it, the personality component. I think a lot of people are a little bit hard on themselves when it comes to the beer they make because they're seeking perfection, So that's going to kind of drive our criticalness, if you will, of our own beer.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, and I definitely absolutely just your perception of yourself and your identity. And I was actually even saying there is a degree to, I was thinking a degree to which receiving feedback from others where people rave about your beer, a problem I have, it's a sign of my own imposter syndrome in a lot of scenarios is any good feedback I get, it's so easy to dismiss that as oh well they're being polite or anything like that. And so also don't of course, be critical and want to get better. And I think those are awesome traits and attributes of people, but definitely give yourself a break now and then too. And just appreciate what you're making.
Well, and one way to get over that bias, or to kind of blind yourself to it, is have a couple of your friends brew the same beer and then go in blind and sample them next to each other, so that you don't know which one is yours. And then you can kind of, privately or even with your friends, kind of rate which ones you like more, talk about the differences, see what there is there. That we've actually done that in our friend group a few times. And it's absolutely, it's a really neat experience. So appreciate the question, Dustin. Really, really good stuff there.
So our next question comes from Ian Holloway with a question on fermentation temperature when fermenting in corny kegs. And Ian says, does the chamber need to be set to a cooler temperature to offset the thickness of the keg? Or is it fine with just expecting your beer to be the temperature that you set the fermentation chamber to?
You've fermented in kegs. I've never fermented in a keg yet. I plan to do so. But this really speaks to, I think, material more so than it does the fermentation vessel. I don't think it matters that much. I think a lot of brewers, home brewers in particular, get really hung up on specific temperatures. Whereas I've started thinking about fermentation temperature in terms of kind of a range. A chest freezer is going to cool the wherever your probe is stuck. It's going to cool that down to under your set point, and then it's going to allow it to warm up to just over your set point. So you've got 3 to 5 degree Fahrenheit or like 2 to 3 degrees Celsius range in there. And as long as your beer stays in that, we've done, 15, 20 degree difference in terms of fermentation temperature experiments, and they're not different. So I don't think you have to worry too much about that.
They're not reliably perceptibly different.
That's what I'm saying. And
I know. I just need to clarify. But
but if you slap that probe onto your an insulated probe onto your keg, you've also got it's a cylinder that's a lot higher than most fermentation vessels. So, presumably that beer is going to probably be more consistently the temperature that you have it set at than in a thicker, kind of a more shallow fermentation vessel. Again, that's just my presumption, but that's what it would seem to me.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, especially like the fact that you're going to give or take a few degrees during fermentation, pretty much no matter what, right? Like that is even in like glycol, Jake's fermenters, which are glycol jacketed, he's going to swing a little bit just because fermentation is going to produce. It's going to then need to compensate for fermentation, which means that it's already reached a temperature outside of that range before anything actually changes. And then of course like the chest freezers, which is what I use, or make that problem worse, because then it needs to like overcompensate a little bit for like the environment, which it's then going to, it's not going to change the temperature of that beer as rapidly.
Right.
So it's a little bit of like, yeah, there's definitely a range in there that it's going to fall within. And I actually ferment a little cooler for that reason, is because I expect it to get a little warmer. So I do think that setting it a little cooler is not a bad idea. But I also don't think that I also don't think it's going to like ruin your beer too much if you get 2 degrees over your intended fermentation temperature.
No.
So I wouldn't worry too much about it. But if you are, like me, you can always, instead of, if you were going to ferment at 64, just ferment at 61 or 62. Like that set, and then you're compensating for it a bit.
It's funny. In talking about this, I've been asked multiple times, why have I settled on 66 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 19C, as my kind of baseline fermentation temperature, which I do a lot of lagers at now. And it's because way back in the day when I was super focused and scared of fermenting too warm, my thought was, well, if I set it at 66, then it'll get up to 68 because of exothermic heat, and all that. But it's always worked. So now I just don't change it. I just keep everything at 66. So thanks for the question. Next question comes from Austin Smith from Wisconsin. He's got a question about attenuation. He says, I've been brewing for about 7 years now, and a couple of years ago, I switched over to all grain. Lately, I've been having an issue with over attenuation. I've used multiple yeasts and different thermometers in my mash. My recent batch was a Munich Dunkel using Y yeast 2206, that's the Bavarian lager, and that was pitched in a starter at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees C. My recipe called for the following gravities: 1049 OG and then down to 1011 FG. The gravities I ended up with were 1058 OG and 1009 FG. I'm not complaining about the extra alcohol, but I wanted a little lower so I could drink this all night long. 6.5% ABV is a little high for me to do that. This seems to be a recurring issue I have with every beer I brew. Any suggestions or what I could change or do differently to hit my numbers? Austin then goes on to say that he uses Brewer's Friend to create his recipes. He has his profiles dialed in and recently started milling his own grain, which resulted in a bump in efficiency from 75 to 81%. Wow. He acknowledges that this is contributing to the higher than expected OG. That's what I was going to comment on first. If you're getting, he got 9 points, SG points higher OG.
Huge.
Yeah.
That is a jump.
Exactly. And which is great, but that's why you're getting a boozier beer. The over attenuation, 1009 from 1011 predicted, to me, that's close to being spot on to expectation.
Well, it's moving like an anticipated attenuation of like 77% to an actual attenuation of 84%.
Right.
Which is not that big. And then also, like, I think 77% is actually like the upper threshold for what Y yeast lists that yeast as in terms of its attenuation. But 84 does not seem like out of question to me, depending on like the beer and depending on those sugars. So I definitely think, like, in terms of getting your numbers down, like now that you started milling your own grain, make sure that you're measuring the mill gap and that's consistent. And then obviously once you start knowing what your original gravity is typically going to be with your new milling, that'll help you dial in, of course, the original gravity. And then honestly, I as far as final gravity goes, it is a touch lower. It doesn't seem lower enough for me to I wouldn't be concerned about like an infection or anything at this point.
Yeah.
definitely keep an eye on it. But honestly, once you get your original gravity dialed in, I think that you're in good shape. Like, it doesn't seem like there's anything necessarily startling or that's wrong here, other than the fact that you did get quite a gravity jump. So just as long as you're getting a consistent mash efficiency, which start, maybe that's one place to start, is just like make sure you're measuring your mash efficiency, like you're just measuring your mash gravity pre-boil, and start to get an idea of like what your actual extraction looks like and dial that in. Yeah. That would be my only thought.
So a couple of thoughts for me. First off, obviously the higher OG, he's milling his own grain now. I'm assuming that he is aware that that's where that probably came from. What I've seen, so if you take an extreme for mash length, right? So Brian has done the experiment on an overnight mash. That beer attenuated very well. If you start warm and you've got, those enzymes are chopping up chopping up those sugars and all that, and then it starts to drop down and get cooler overnight, which is naturally going to happen. There's a lot of talk about denaturing of the amylase enzymes and all of this stuff. I've seen multiple times that even if you mash in at say 154F and then it drops down to 146 or so, I get higher attenuation when that happens. My calculator, Beersmith, is set to 154 though. So it's telling me that if you kept a stable 154 Fahrenheit, you're going to get, 1011 FG. Well, it dropped lower, and every time that happens, I don't care what anyone says, my observation, what I have witnessed many times, is when it drops lower like that, I get a lower FG than is predicted. Now, one way to remedy that, do a shorter mash. We've shown over and over and over again that you can mash for 25 to 30 minutes and get very good conversion. Maybe take a 2 or 3% hit on your typical brew house efficiency. But that mash is going to stay more, you're not giving it as much time for the temperature to drop, right? So that's one way to do it. The other thing is just mash warmer and see what happens. If you're mashing at 156 or 158 Fahrenheit and you're still getting that super low FG, you might want to consider whether it's the malt that you're using. I've done malt comparisons. In fact, I had to set up different profiles in Beersmith because when I would use Pilsner malt as the primary base versus pale malt as a primary base, I'd get more attenuation. So there could be something like that, but you might also want to, be very wary of a contamination. I think that's, if you're drinking the beer quickly, you may not even notice that it's there, but if you let it sit for a while, it can start to taste kind of bad. That would be an indicator of potential contamination. Whenever I see a much lower FG than I'm expecting, that's where my brain goes first. So
yeah, that seems fair. And I do think on your note about just like malts in general, you should be able to access like the malt spec sheet in some way of what that is. And if you go ahead and take a look at that, and you can plug those numbers into Beersmith as well, or Brewer's Friend. I actually don't know if you can do it in Brewer's Friend, but I'm sure you can. And that'll help you hit your numbers a little more accurately as well. Yeah. The next question comes from Jared Bradley from 7 Mile, Ohio. And Jared says, I won a pouch of Imperial yeast, which is juice, at a homebrew club meeting raffle. At the time, it was already pretty old, but now it is a year old. I probably won't need that type of yeast for another few months. Would you just throw it out and get a new pouch, make a starter and don't sweat it, or even just direct pitch it and don't sweat it?
Well, he submitted this question probably 3 or 4 months ago, so it's well over a year old now. But I tend to be if I'm going to prop up a really old pitch of yeast, whether it's from a new pouch or if it's something that I harvested, I'm not going to pitch it direct. If it's old, I just don't want to risk it. If I'm going to spend all the time making wort, I don't want to potentially ruin it. I have no problems wasting a little bit of DME and making a starter though. And if you get activity, it smells decent, then I'm comfortable pitching it. You might want to prop it up a couple times. So do a step starter where you make a smaller starter, get it going, and then add that to a bigger starter so it can really get that viability up. But yeah, I would have no issues trying that out.
I can't believe this. I agree with you 100%. And all I wrote on my note sheet here for this was to say, call Marshall on his bullshit. Because I expected you to say to direct pitch it.
I would never. Not if it's a year old.
I can't believe it. I do. I agree with you 100%. Do a step starter with like a touch lower gravity wort, get it built up over time, potentially like a little yeast nutrient if you want to be super paranoid. And then probably brew day of, like do a vitality starter. Yeah. Just make sure it's all good to go and then pitch it. I'm 100% with you.
That's exactly what I would do. And also, man, I mean, yes, I direct pitch 99% of the time now because Imperial yeast packages 200 billion cells. But I'm using fresh yeast. I'm not advocating that people do, pitched year-old yeast into their beer. So Jared, do a step start. If you even still have this yeast, do a step starter and let us know how it turns out. I'm sure it'll work. I mean, the yeast doesn't.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So yeah. Anyways, so next question comes from I don't know if this is their real name, but Enron. So here's what Enron had to say. I've heard you say often that you typically dry hop sometime during the middle or tail end of active fermentation, which for most batches is 2 to 4 days, I would imagine, which has the advantage of reducing oxidation since the yeast are still scrubbing O2. However, since you don't want to leave the hops in contact with the beer too long, I'm curious what your typical mid-strength beer fermentation schedule is. I typically leave my beer in primary for 3 weeks, then move to a keg, pressurize, and serve right away. If I'm dry hopping, I add them after about 2 weeks and then let them marinate for a week to finish things off, staying close to that 3-week schedule. With this schedule, if I were to dry hop on day 3 of fermentation, the hops would be in contact with the beer for over 2 weeks. In recent personal experience, this has yielded undesirable hop flavors. When dry hopping during active fermentation, do you ferment condition in the fermenter for a shorter period of time than transfer to a keg to finish conditioning, or do you find your beer to be drinkable after 10 to 14 days? I always try to be patient with my beers, allowing them to fully mature in the fermenter so I don't have issues with diacetyl or green flavors from cold crashing too quickly. Maybe I'm waiting too long unnecessarily.
So let's start here. My personal schedule, when I'm dry hopping like a moderate strength beer, so let's say like 6% alcohol, 5 to 7 maybe is moderate-ish. It's actually probably a little higher, but I'll do that. I actually just made a double IPA, so this is actually good timing. I will, like I said earlier, I actually ferment a little lower than Marshall and like just generally and ferment a little bit lower for most of my beers. And so like on day 4, typically, and when and again, like you can measure it. It's easy with a keg to take these measurements. It depends on what fermenter you have, but if you can get a gravity sample, just when you have a couple gravity points left for fermentation, I will then dry hop around day 4, and I'll also turn up the temperature a little bit during that time, just to help fermentation carry along and make sure that it's still fermenting. And then I will dry hop for roughly like 5 days or so. That I found I've done a lot of different lengths of dry hopping, and I found 5 days to be a good spot for me.
Yeah.
I like the character from it, and I feel like you get a good aroma without necessarily some of that grassy, maybe like oily, resiny character. And so I'll transfer to a serving keg and carbonate, and then that probably ends up being around day 17 or 18 or so that I would start drinking that if I had to guess. So it's almost 3 weeks for me too. But at the same time, like that will be like that dry hop still takes place during fermentation. So that's what I've been doing. I think it's worth calling attention to that. I understand the desire to have like a standard approach for how long an ale is in the fermenter. I think hoppy styles tend to do fine a touch younger.
Yeah.
And also, just as a side note, if you are worried about like cold side oxidation, especially with dry hopping, you have alternatives than just for dry hopping during fermentation. I do that because it's what's easiest for me, and I don't want to burn too much CO2 doing all of my flushing and forcing out of SAR sand and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I've seen people who will just like continuously flush with CO2 while they're adding the dry hops, and they've had good experiences with that, which I'm sure it's not perfect, and what I do isn't perfect, but it's also another option you have. But yeah, I don't think you're waiting too long unnecessarily, but I think you'd be okay if you did it a little shorter.
That you just hit on what I was going to say. I don't want to come across as saying that you should do something different because it's
Exactly.
it's your brewing. I would never. I remember the days when it was 3-2-1, right, or whatever 1-2. I forget exactly what it is now because it's been so long. But 3 weeks in primary, by the third week, if I'm brewing a batch, I'm already halfway through the keg. For most styles. So I'm 3 weeks in primary. I'm the most impatient person on earth compared to that. I mean, geez, my schedule, if I'm doing a dry hopped beer, which I don't make very much of these days, would be pitch the yeast, and then once I see high kreuzen, I don't usually add hops at high kreuzen. I do it at the tail end of fermentation, as Enron noted, which is like 4 days in. So I'll add the dry hops, and then as soon as I see, and I do what you do, if I'll ramp the temp up to about 72 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is like 21, 22 degrees C. And I'll let it sit there until fermentation's complete, which is like another 3 days, you know?
Yeah. Honestly, like day 10 is usually out of primary for me for quite a few things.
Exactly. And the reason is because I'll take a sample, you know, and I've got my fermenters these days have ball valves and I can attach CO2. So I'll pull a hydrometer sample out, and if it doesn't smell like diacetyl, if it tastes good, I want, especially hoppy beers, I want it as fresh as possible. He used the word mature. That's the last thing I want with a hoppy beer. I don't want any maturing happening. I want it to be ready, done, fresh, and drinking it by week 2. Usually, I've got it kegged and drinking, off the tap. So that's the approach I take, and I've done fairly well with some hoppier beers that I've made in competition that were brewed exactly that way. If 3 weeks works for you, like you said, Matt, I would flush it. I'm so terrified of cold side oxidation on hoppy beers these days that I'd figure out some way of adding those hops in a O2 free environment because oxidized hoppy beers suck. So, well, we've got to get to another break. We're going to be back with more Brü A questions after these messages.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Alrighty, we've got another pile of questions to get to. Matt, why don't you kick us off?
So our first question here comes from Jonathan Newman, and Jonathan says that I have been brewing for close to 1.5 years now and just love everything from the process to the finished product and everything in between. One thing I have trouble with is patience. I have become an avid brewer with Kvike yeast due to their interesting flavors and esters. Usually, though, I tend to cold crash, keg, and force carb it to pretty much about 2 or 3 days after it has reached its final gravity. I keep reading about maturation and cleaning of the beer by the yeast. This is one thing that has confused me, as I can't seem to find anything concrete-ish about it. Should I leave the beer longer on the yeast in the primary to let it clean up, and if so, how long? Also, even after cold crashing, will the beer still mature and mellow? Because I understand that most of the yeast will become dormant and drop out due to the cold.
So, in the olden days, and I'm talking like a decade plus ago, it was very common for an opinion to be stated by somebody with authority in brewing, and then that applied to everything. So if you're making a Pilsner, if you're making a IPA, if you're making a brown ale, you just do the same thing. And when it comes to the amount of time in primary and how long you let it sit, that was one of the big ones. You always let it sit for a minimum of 2 weeks so that it would clean up any off flavors, or diacetyl was a big one. You wanted that yeast to remetabolize any diacetyl that was created. These days, we've got such good quality yeast, And you've also got your own nose and palate. And I feel like I don't want to minimize the importance of tasting your damn beer and you deciding when it's done. If you let it sit on that yeast too long, the one thing a lot of people don't talk about that they used to is you let it sit for too long, you could pick up what I perceive as being kind of a yeasty character. It's almost like, and it's usually pretty subtle until you get to the bottom of the keg. It gets even stronger. It's almost like when you are making, I make pizza dough. I don't really make bread, but as that pizza dough starts to rise, so 4 or 5 hours after putting the dough together, there's that really yeasty kind of sweet bread smell. That's what I get in the beers that I've let sit in primary for too long. And too long to me is 3 to 4 weeks. So I don't think we're all impatient. We all want to drink the beer soon. If you're not letting it sit long and you like the beers you're making though, I mean, that's go for it, Jonathan.
I think that's the key point. Like I think theoretically and philosophically, I disagree a little bit. Like I do think, like obviously maturing during primary is, I mean, that's just what primary fermentation is, right? Like we can call it maturing as in like, oh, now it's different than actually just fermenting, but it's not, it's all just one thing. But I will say, like, if you're enjoying your beer and you're happy with it, then that's important.
Yeah.
That's a big part of it. I will also note here that you're saying you're using a lot of Kvike yeast, and Lars Marius Garshall has talked before about about Kvike yeasts actually typically needing less like maturing time than other traditional yeasts, at least traditional here. So that is another thing to consider, is like it is yeast dependent as well. It's not just going to be straight up rule of just a straight rule for everything that you do. It's going to be style dependent. It's going to be similar to the last time we talked about, like the IPA. Like it's going to be style dependent. It's going to be yeast dependent. It's going to be just batch dependent in your process. So as long as you're happy, that's what it means. But again, like I leave my beers for 10 to 14 days on average, because I've done it before where I pulled them at like, oh, I'm going to do a quick IPA and pull it at day 5. And I just don't like that beer as much as when I pulled it at day 10. So it's just a personal preference, whatever it comes down to, and stick with what makes you happy. Yeah.
And just a final point, the reason I wanted to point out the we have our noses and our palates and we should be tasting stuff isn't to say that, your opinion's the only one that matters, or if you don't taste it, then it's perfect, whatever. My point there is that these different yeast strains in particular have different characteristics. And for example, I believe the Pilsner Urquell strain is known for producing a little bit more diacetyl than other lager strains. So with that one, smell it, taste it, and when that's gone, when you notice that's gone, then it's probably good to go as long as you've reached your final gravity. I had an experience one time. I forget what it was. I think it was called Windsor. Danstar has like a Windsor strain.
Oh yeah. That's what one of their dry yeasts.
Yeah, it's like an English strain that's also known for producing more diacetyl. Well, I just thought I didn't know this at the time, and I think I did a 7-day turnaround mild or something like that, and this thing was just chock full of buttery flavor, and so I didn't follow my own advice on this. It was years and years ago, and it didn't turn out well. I was told by friends after the fact, well, if you would let it sit for a little longer, that strain's known for this. So that's what I mean. It's there's not a one size fits all. If you're going to leave every beer for 3 weeks in primary, you're probably going to be fine if you're down with that. But I'm like Jonathan. I'm impatient and I want to get to drinking that beer. So, all right. Next question comes from Tim Gray, who's from Melbourne, Australia. He says, us homebrewers, both newcomers and veterans, often worry about infecting their brews and equipment with unwanted nasties. I think we could all agree that the clean down, I don't know what that means, is one of the most undesirable parts of a brew day. And this seemingly endless task, born out of necessity, eats into our precious time. More so for those with family commitments. Oh, we call it clean up over here, not clean down. Nah. That being said...
Yeah, he's talking about cleaning.
Yeah, I picked that up, yeah. That being said, we all know someone who flies in the face of sanitation and challenges the norm. For example, I've known an avid homebrewer who has likely never sanitized an empty beer bottle. Their process is to simply wash out any leftover beer with warm water, and the bottle is all set for next bottling day. Hundreds of brews in and not a single infection. Then there's the next guy who hasn't once taken apart and cleaned his keg's dip tubes. Again, no issues. My question, gentlemen, urging you to be both brave and vulnerable. What are your cleaning confessions or hacks?
I'm terrified by this question.
You don't want to hear my response. That's why.
This could be, I am a little nervous about it. Like it is, this could be an episode, I think, in its own. is just like, what are your confessions here? I will say, as someone who has had a bottle explode, I am very nervous about the fact that he's not cleaning the bottles. So that, I mean, good. Thank God that he's okay, like that nothing has happened. He's got no infections. That's
I don't
good.
believe he's never had an infection. I'll be honest, Tim. Sorry, buddy.
Maybe he hasn't picked it up or drink it young. I don't know.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Anyways, I almost don't want to go first, but let me give you one of each. I'll give you a confession and a hack. And this is not a safe space, so this really sucks. Is that I try really hard to keep a clean space, and I'm a very anxious person, so I typically am just putzing around and like picking stuff up or cleaning things. And I do need before I say this, I want to say on the record that this is both not how beers are served to me during like experiments for COVID. It's not how I package beers for participants. I have like a counterflow bottle filler that I use for that. And I swear I intend to do it at some point in the future. Jake, get off my ass. So my confession, I think it has been well over a year since I last cleaned the beer lines on my kegerator for my personal consumption.
You're weak, bro. That's a weak confession.
I think it's been almost 2 years, and I've run a sour through them. I've run ciders. I've run a mead. I've run several beers. And the kegerator itself, I don't think I've cleaned those beer lines. I promise I intend to. And thinking about it, it's very disgusting. I don't like it.
So I swap out I clean them between every batch. I have a keg that I just have a beer line cleaner in, and then every time I swap out a keg, I run some beer line cleaner and I let it sit in the lines until I put a new keg on. So I'm better than you on that front.
Yeah, I've not done that. You are much better than me on that.
But I'll tell you, like Tim said about his friend in the dip tubes, I definitely don't take all of my kegs apart between every single batch. In part because, this is not a recommendation. We're confessing here. In part because the way I think about it is if I pull the keg out of the keezer and I take it over and that beer was good, right? There was nothing wrong with it. And I take it over, that dip tube, the top of the dip tube where the post is at, isn't really touching the beer. It's just the tube, right? So what I do is I fill it with hot water and cleaner, and then I run that out of the dip tube, and I'll take a toothbrush. I have a toothbrush just for cleaning beer stuff or brewing stuff, and I'll scrub around the inside of the dip tube and get the post nice and clean, and then I sanitize it. And so I guess that's a confession. Now, here's the thing though. I consider myself a fairly anal person when it comes to sanitation, but I just presumed every brewer was like that. It was like something we shared until I brewed with this one guy. I'm not going to say names because I love this guy dearly. And I could not believe the stuff he was doing that I would just never, I realized how anal I was when I brewed with this guy. And, and his beers are turning out okay. And it's weird because there are things that people do that I would never consider doing, and their beer comes out. It's part of what kind of inspired the short and shoddy approach, I think, is that I'm looking at all this going, man, I'm wasting time, it seems, doing all this stuff, cleaning and whatever it is. And I have a buddy, my good friend Sean Wood, one of the best brewers I know. He runs the sour program at House of Pendragon. When he is bottling beers for competition, he doesn't purge the bottles. He sanitizes them, and then he takes a picnic tap set to a really low level, and he just pours it into the bottle. I'm going, dude, how do you make such good beer? And that's the way you're bottling. I mean, the guy's won best of show in competitions with beers bottled that way. So, confessions, I've never, ever, ever, ever sanitized anything on the hot side. Is that a confession? I don't know. I hear these people.
I don't think it is. That's not a confession.
It's a weak one, right?
Tell you what, I've actually got a better one. I thought of a better one for you. I think for like the first year and a half, I didn't sanitize my fermenter at all.
What?
That's my actual confession. I was a college student. I was like poor, so I didn't want to spend like $8 on Star San or like Iota 4. And so for the first year, when I had like this 3-gallon better bottle, it was like pretty much just OxyClean washes. Everything else, like the lines and stuff, would get sanitized from, I would like have just different, anything that could go in the oven did. Like I used heat to sanitize a bunch of things. But yeah, the fermenter itself, like I didn't use Star San for a long time. And I actually never really had a problem. Which, like, looking back, or at least I didn't perceive I had a problem, which I very well could have. Like, I definitely, looking back, that's my new confession. The other one, everyone can forget about. That is my actual confession. It's like, first year and a half, I didn't sanitize a fermenter.
This question is too fun. I'm just thinking about all of these little things. I don't know if I have any hacks in terms of cleaning and sanitation. I mean, I'm a nut. I just clean everything. That's how I am in my real life too. I like clean. So.
I don't have a hack necessarily, but I will say that I recently got like 2 CIP spray balls, one for a keg cleaner and one that I've attached to like a stainless steel lid that fits over my kettles.
Cool.
And it's been a huge quality of life upgrade. So that's been really nice. Like, it's not a hack. It's by no means like unique or like interesting, but it's been really nice just to use for cleaning. It makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, I've heard they're convenient, but we could go on forever on this one. Now I'm thinking of, you were talking about OxyClean. I've heard from many people who say that at brewery water, PBW or OxyClean, the stuff people are using to clean their fermenters actually has a antimicrobial component to it as well. I'm just,
It might, because I got lucky for a year and a half, or at least like to a point where I never was tasting like vomit or something like that.
All right. That was a great question. And now
it was great. Tell you what, let's move on. We have a question from Daniel Erb, and it's stemming from a prior Brü A question about bulk hops. And I think this was one of our last ones, Marshall.
Yeah, it was.
How long so 2 questions here. One, how long would you trust hops that are stored in air minimized Ziplocs in a chest freezer? And then 2, do you use hop aging tools, such as in Beersmith, to adjust the alpha acids? I have been, and my beers have been coming out more bitter than I would expect. I can, and likely will, simply stop adjusting the alpha acids, but I would like some additional comment.
These are such good questions for this show.
Yeah.
So to respond to number 1, how long would you trust hops that are stored in air minimized Ziploc bags in a chest freezer? Honestly, 4 years, 3-4 years. I've talked to folks, various folks up in Yakima about this whole hop aging thing. Oxygen is a killer of most things, right? It keeps us alive, but oxidation can really ruin flavor and aroma in certain things. When you keep hops in a freezer, that reduces the oxidation massively. So if they're in the freezer and you're taking them out just to pour a little bit out, and then you're using those and you're putting them right back into the freezer. Honestly, I've used hops that are 4 years old that taste exactly. I mean, not a comparison, but we've done a couple hop age experiments. Certain hops, if they're stored open and in a warm environment, they are going to go bad. We've done that experiment as well. They don't taste good. If you're keeping them in a freezer, 3-4 years, I think most people are using hops before that. So a lot of brewers worry about, I just got these, I'm going to put them in. I don't have a vacuum sealer. I'm going to throw them in the freezer. I have to throw them away after 3 months. Whatever. Don't do that. Try to get the air out, put them in a dark, cold freezer, and you're good to go. I haven't been vacuum sealing my hops for the last 2 years now, because I prefer keeping them in the Yakima Valley Hops package. Just they're convenient, and I've not had any issues. Now, do I use hop aging tools? Absolutely not. Every time I've had a beer where somebody does that, it's the same exact experience as you, Daniel. The beer's way too bitter. I was talking with Brad Smith. In fact, last week, an episode of his show's coming out that I was on. And after we got done recording, he was like, man, the amount of trust and faith that users of Beersmith put into all of these hop calculations. He's like, most of those are just theoretical, and we've done it. We've had beers tested for actual IBU.
Yes, yep.
And it's always different than Tinsith or Garrett's or Rager. My assumption here is that yes, alpha acids degrade over time. We know that. But if you're keeping them in a freezer, it's probably not nearly as much as those calculators. Just don't use the calculator. Treat the hops like you just bought them. That's my opinion. That's what I've done. I've never had issues with bitterness, unless I'm overcorrecting for age.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I mean, in terms of like having them in the freezer, I don't know. I think 3 years seemed like when you said that, I was like, oh, that's a lot. That seems like it's a big amount, Marshall. But so I was honestly like, I think a year or two, or like I honestly probably wouldn't worry about it. My hops never really make it that long.
Yeah.
I guess fortunately it's probably a good thing. I do actually vacuum seal all of mine still, just because I am dogmatic like that in a lot of ways. So I still vacuum seal them. I put them in the freezer, and I would trust them for at the minimum a year. Definitely, I think it'd be fine for more. As far as the hop aging tools, yeah, I just think like so much of IBU is all just like ballparking. Like we're trying to get within a certain degree of accuracy for it.
Yeah.
And in terms of like adjusting the alpha acids, like we don't know, or I mean, there's theoretical and there's also like papers done on like degradation of alpha acids over time. Of course, that is like a very, very real thing. But I have also had the same experience. Like I don't know that it's as linear as the calculators make it seem. And so I wouldn't do it personally.
Yeah. Well, and to kind of finish this one off, I have had, if I'm spending, $25 on a pound of Citra or something, I'm going to treat those ones a little bit different than I do, say, a $12 a pound bag of Willamette or something. So I don't know if if there is a difference. I don't know if they're going to react differently. But I was using last year. I made a beer with, I think it was 2014 Tettninger, and it was phenomenal. It worked out perfectly fine. I had all the floral characters I expect from it. It was perfectly bitter. Just take care, mind the temperature, the oxygen exposure, but don't worry too much about it. I think we kind of overthink some things, and that's one of them. So next question comes from Max Deprins from London, England, with a he's got a question on wort aeration. He says, I've been looking to get an answer on this for a while now, but I can't find any conclusive feedback online. I noticed you use a plastic wort aerator. I used to, the one that fans out the cooled wort over, or when you're pouring it through the tubing into the fermenter, which looks like a cheap and easy way of doing the job. I've always shaked and rocked mine around, but I was looking to either upgrade to pure O2 or to use the plastic wort aerator like you. Could you please share how you aerate your wort? I will say again, I don't use that anymore. I just pour with vigor into my fermentation vessel. But I know, Matt, you are a wort oxygenator.
I am. I use pure O2 or I don't. And that is like kind of the options. I either use pure O2, and that is typically if I want like a really, really clean beer, or if I am, or higher gravity beers, I will, or if I think the yeast might be old or something, like if I have reason to believe that the yeast isn't going to be like performing optimally, I will use pure O2 just to make a better environment. Otherwise, like if I'm making a starter, especially a big starter, I might not aerate just because like I think that's going to introduce enough oxygen, like it's going to get the job done. And I've done it so many times where it's just make a big starter, pitch it, don't worry about it. And that's also with kind of like spraying, like somewhat to you, Marshall, like somewhat aggressively spraying the wort into the keg, like just, and not using an aerator, but just like it draining into it with a little bit of vigor, right? Yeah. So that's kind of like sticking with the vulnerable theme from earlier, is I don't always aerate all my beers, especially if I have a big starter, but I use pure O2. I think it's really convenient. It's only not convenient to get O2 tanks. That kind of sucks. That part's not fun, but otherwise I use pure O2. I like having the kind of insurance, I guess, of it. It always gives me like a warm feeling that I'm doing something right. So that's just based on my own like past, how I learned to homebrew, not like any pure experience. Cause I've done experiments before of like no O2 versus 2 or 3 doses. And I haven't really been able to pick up wild differences like in an Imperial Stout once. So it's certainly in question, but that would be my thing, is I think starters or just like pure O2 is nice. It's convenient.
I have never brewed a beer on my own that was oxygenated. I don't even own an oxygen tank. I never have. I got to be over 500 batches of beer. I had one stuck fermentation one time, and it was because of a thermometer issue. My thermometer wasn't calibrated. I think I matched it like 170 or something. I've never had an issue with it. And when I think about the purpose of oxygenation and the nutritious aspect of for the yeast and so it grows and it can bud off and do all that. If you're pitching really healthy yeast and you're pitching it from a starter, especially, it seems to moot the oxygenation piece of it. Now, do I aerate wort? Yeah, I don't use that spray thing anymore because it broke and I didn't want to buy another one. So I just drain it into my fermenter harshly and it gets foamy. But again, I've never had an issue with not oxygenating. Maybe would my beers be better if I did? Maybe, but our experiments seem to call that into question, like you said, Matt. And I know you make, if I were making really big beers all the time, which you make more of than I do, I would do it just as risk aversion.
I do. Yeah, that's exactly why I do it.
Yeah, and because what if, right? And so it's just good. You don't want to ruin it. You want it to ferment as actively as possible, so you kind of give it the extra boost. But I'm making largely 1060 and under beers, and I've never had an issue. So I rocking it and shaking it seems fine to me. Also, those little plastic aerators cost like $1.50. So if you want one, just get it, I guess.
Well, speaking of yeast starters, Leon Shotos wrote in with a question about them, and Leon said, "I finally bought a stir plate after brewing for a few years. I help a few of my friends brew sometimes, and they help me with the stir plate. I thought it would save money to make a big starter with one yeast pack and split the starter. My friend and I brewed back-to-back batches of similar beers that would use the same yeast, so we made the starter big enough to split into 2 for both batches. Then I thought, why not split a starter regularly? So recently I brewed with 1056 American ale yeast from Weist and built the starter 2 times too big. I kept half of it in a container in the fridge and pitched the other half. Since this is only a starter and not recovered yeast from a primary or a secondary, it isn't flavor contaminated, it's just a starter. The next time I brewed, I did the same thing with the container. I built it double and saved half of it. I'm planning on doing this a few times. I can use it for any beer that I want to make with 1056. Does anyone do this? Am I missing something? I'm wondering if, I don't know what you would be missing. I'm wondering if there might be a major downside that I haven't considered, maybe just like things to consider, but not downsides necessarily. Also, how many generations of starters can I get away with this method? Bear in mind that the starter never comes from an actual brew. It only continues from the last starter. Marshall, you have thoughts on this.
Boy, that method sounds familiar, doesn't it? Jeez. I actually, one of the first articles I ever wrote for brewlosophy.com was on yeast harvesting using this very method. So yes, does anyone do this? I think probably tens of thousands of people are doing this at this point. I hear from folks all the time who are harvesting yeast from starters. It's a very clean way to do it. It's my preferred way, obviously. So yeah, are you missing anything? I don't think so. One thing that you have to keep in mind is that yeast will inevitably drift. Your generational drift is a thing. Now, I can't speak for every strain. I've only done this with a handful of strains, but I've taken some. The one that I took out the furthest was 15 generations, and I gave that 16th generation to a buddy of mine, and that was the last of it. He brewed a beer. It worked out fine for him as well. Is that to say that 15th version of it would taste the same as version 1? I don't know. That would be a great comparison, which I think we should actually probably get an experiment designed to do that. I think the only experiment we've done has been generation 5 versus a fresh pitch, and those weren't perceptibly different. So it's an awesome way to save some money and conserve your yeast. And sounds like you're doing it right, bud. So.
Yeah, it's a great way to, I've done that as well. And if I do save some yeast, then that is typically how I'll do it, is just overbuild that starter, get some additional yeast and just like continue that process and be ready to go. So I think it's a great idea. I would also say, is the one thing I do want to speak to is like, cause I think you nailed it, Marshall. I think you're spot on. I don't think we need to go into that too much more, but I do want to get at this, how far can I push it? Just in terms of this generational drift. And last year I was invited to a Midnight Carboys meeting. It's a homebrew club here in Illinois. I think they're in Crystal Lake, and super nice guys. And it's a great meeting, and I had tons of fun. And there was a brewer there who it's kind of, I don't think I'm going to say it's like a running joke, but it's not a joke. Like, it is a reality of his brewing that he pretty much just has like a house yeast that he's been using for a very, very, we're talking like several years, like I think 5 to 10 years, like a very long time.
Wow.
And just brews with that yeast like over and over again. And I had one of the beers and it was fine. Like, it tasted fine. Like, whether or not it would have tasted different with like a straight up fresh pitch of 1056, like maybe, but also this beer was good. So like that's another thing too, is like, is it going to taste slightly different? Maybe, but different doesn't necessarily mean worse or even better.
Yeah.
So there is going to be drift. And I do think that it's something that, you just be on top of. If you are getting a character you don't love, like, keep that in mind as you're brewing with it. But for the most part, I wouldn't worry.
Yeah, me either. Just be aware of sanitation, mind that component of it. And I think you're fine. I mean, before there were yeast labs, commercial yeast labs, one of the best ways to kind of control your brewing process was to harvest your yeast and reuse it so that you could have as consistent of a product as possible. So you're
still
doing
a big
things.
thing.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not old. That's current.
That's what I'm saying now, though, is we've got labs who will bank it for them and do all that stuff. I mean,
right.
But top cropping was a thing, and it's kind of the same idea. So yeah, you're doing good things there, Leon. So, well, there you have it, folks. That's 140th episode in the books. I can't believe it, man. 140 episodes. Thanks again to everyone for listening and supporting us in the various ways that you do, especially our patrons. We honestly would not be here without you, and I mean that. If you have any questions you'd like us to answer on a future Brü A episode, make sure to email them to feedback@brulosophy.com and indicate that it's for Brü A in the subject line. Otherwise, I might just respond with an answer in the email, and we'll be sure to add that to the list if you submit it that way. Stay safe out there, and make sure to head over to brulosophy.com to read up on all of the nerdy beer stuff we are up to. The Brulosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brulosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brulosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brulosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no